I think it would surprise a lot of Utahns to realize how hard it is for veterans to transition into civilian life. They don't understand the issues. They don't understand the disconnect between the federal government, especially the military, and what it's like for the state. They assume, like so many do, that the federal government is heavily tied to state government and it's heavily tied to local government, and it's just not correct. The military is its own separate thing from all of the other federal programs that the state and local governments participate in. The primary thing that's broken in Utah's licensing system when it comes to veterans is just there's no acknowledgement of military service. And this holds true for any industry, for any occupation outside of what is usually the traditional path of going to college, getting a bachelor's degree, following a set of rules and regulations in order to qualify for the license. Licensing boards are essentially going to be making recommendations to the Department of Professional Licensing. We call it DOPL in Utah. DOPL is the one that actually extends the licenses. They are the ones that verify that the person applying for it has met all of the requirements in order to get that license. And because, again, there is such a disconnect between what people do in the military, because a lot of the jobs in the military, the job titles don't exactly align to what the jobs are, what the occupational licenses are in the civilian world, and they don't have the staff to actually bridge that gap. That leads to a lot of consternation from veterans when they can't go to DOPL and say, this is what my job was, this is what I did, why can't you just figure this out? Veterans are often asked to redo training they've already completed in the military because the government doesn't know what that training was. They don't understand what the job was. They don't understand the experiences that veterans have. And because they don't know these things, they're not going to go out on a limb for something they don't understand. So it's easier to just make these people jump through all of the same hoops, regardless of what their background was, regardless of what their training was, regardless of what their education was in the military, because they just don't understand it. These licensing delays can last years. It depends on what the requirements are for the job, because some of it requires education that they don't receive. It really depends on the status of the veteran. Are they an officer or are they enlisted? By rule, most officers, the vast majority of officers, have to have a degree in order to be an officer. So generally their education, while it doesn't have any specific requirements for some jobs in the military, they already have a degree. And so it might not exactly match up with the license they're going for, but it usually does. Whereby an enlisted person has no formal education. The only education they have is what they received in the military, outside of being a high school graduate, for the most part. And so that is very, very difficult for the civilian world to translate that into college credits, into any type of interpretation of a degree requirement, because they just don't understand, they don't know. It's really not listed. Even sometimes with the DD-214, which is the discharge document for veterans, exactly what was in the courses that they were taught. A military crosswalk, in very simple terms, is just a pathway, it's guidelines for DOPL to use to understand how military experience will translate into the civilian world for the occupational licenses that Utah has. There are about 50 different professions that this would help for Utah veterans. The vast majority of them are in healthcare, but it's not all. Electricians, you also have veterinarians, there are accountants. So if you want to get your CPA license, there are some jobs in the military that translate well to those things. It really depends on the licensing scheme and what the requirements are. I mean, there are not going to be a ton of jobs that are in the military that translate. Utah is actually pretty good about the types of licenses, the number of different types of licenses they have. So it is difficult for some members of the military to qualify for a license because there is really no civilian equivalent of that. On the flip side, that's actually good, because then they can just start doing what they were doing in the military, and they don't need the government's permission to do that. Utah is not the first state to do this. The first state was actually Pennsylvania, and it was done by their Department of Professional Licensing. And it was a project. They got a grant from the Department of Defense to do this, and it came out of a lot of different surveys with veterans over many years to understand the landscape of what it was like for a veteran once they transitioned out of active duty service and trying to apply their trade across the state of Pennsylvania. We picked up on it a few years ago, and we started doing research about a year and a half ago. And one of the biggest reasons why our DOPL hasn't already done this is mainly just resources. It took 18 months of intensive work by multiple people on our team to go through every job listing in every branch of the military, look at all of the job duties, look at Utah's licenses, look at all those requirements, all of the job duties that for those jobs, and match them up. We handed over all of the information to DOPL and the Department of Military Affairs and Veterans Affairs for Utah, so they could see all of the work that we had done. One of the biggest pushbacks that we received from DOPL was that they just didn't have the resources to do this. And once I saw what it took for us to do it, I realized, yeah, they probably didn't have the resources to do it. Luckily, one of the things they've told us is based on the information we have given them, they're really not going to need a ton of resources to actually implement this. They actually asked us to take the implementation date off of the bill because they think they can roll it out sooner rather than later. We were hoping to give them, a good 8-9 months to get it up and running, and they said based on the information we gave them, they can actually do it sooner, which is great. We're all for that. We want to put this more in regulation than in statute and give them the wide latitude so they can address changes as they come up. That way we don't have to come back to the legislature every time one of the branches decides to change the job description, when they combine jobs, when they eliminate jobs, and that way the legislature doesn't have to do this. DOPL can do that themselves. The most frustrating thing for veterans when they're getting out and transitioning is they don't really understand why it has to function the way it does in the civilian world. Why state governments, why local governments are so hesitant to trust the federal government that they've been able to do these jobs for so long, and they should be able to continue to do them. And they don't understand the disconnect between the three levels of government. And it mostly doesn't make any sense because they should be talking to each other. And what we're trying to do is make it as easy as possible for them when they do transition out. When they can't find work, when they can't do the things that they've been trained to do, because of some bureaucratic red tape that says we don't understand what you were doing in the military, so we're going to make you do all of the same things that we would make everybody else do, even though you've been doing it already. And it just leads to a waste of taxpayer resources when they've already been trained to do a certain job, and they're wanting to do essentially the same thing, and they're not allowed to.